December 12, 1939. The forest held its breath. Simo Häyhä pressed his cheek against the frozen stock of his Mosin Nagant rifle, the metal so cold it burned through his wool balaclava. Around him, the birch trees stood like skeletal sentries, their white bark blending seamlessly with the snow that buried everything, the hills, the fallen logs, the bodies from last week's patrol. 3 feet of it, maybe 4. Deep enough to swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong. He didn't step wrong. I am 24 years old, 5'3". A farmer's son from Rautjärvi who'd spent more time hunting squirrels than studying maps. And now he lay in a sniper's nest, carved into a snowbank along the Kala River, watching the eastern tree line through iron sights that had no magnification, no scope, nothing but brutal simplicity. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees Celsius overnight. His breath came in shallow, controlled puffs, never through the mouth, always through the nose, so the steam wouldn't give away his position. He'd packed snow into his mouth earlier to keep the vapor down. It made his teeth ache, but it kept him invisible. That was the game now, invisibility. 300 meters downslope, the Soviet 163rd Rifle Division was settling into their forward positions. Simo could hear them even from here, the clank of mess tins, the crunch of boots on packed snow, the occasional bark of an officer trying to maintain order in the chaos. They'd crossed the border 4 days ago with tanks, artillery, and 43,000 men. Finland had responded with white camouflage suits, skis, and spite. Simo adjusted his position, feeling the creak of frozen leather against his skin. His white snowsuit was handmade, stitched by his mother from old bedsheets. It had no uniform markings, no insignia. Just fabric and willpower. Beneath it, he wore 3 layers of wool, but the cold still found its way in. It always did. To his left, hidden in another snowbank 20 meters away, was Martti Antikainen, childhood friend. Better shot with a pistol than anyone Simo had ever seen. They'd been hunting partners since they were 12, tracking elk through these same woods in summer, when the ground was soft and the mosquitoes were thick as smoke. Now the mosquitoes were dead, and so were a lot of men. Marty's voice came through the silence, barely a whisper. "You see the one with the binoculars?" Simo's eyes tracked left. There. A Soviet officer, standing too tall, scanning the Finnish tree line with Zeiss field glasses that probably cost more than Simo's entire farm. The man wore a fur-lined coat, the kind that screamed, "I matter," the kind that made him a target. "I see him," Simo murmured. Range? Simo didn't need to calculate. He'd walked these ridges 100 times before the war. 320. Winds pushing east at maybe 2 meters per second. "You taking it?" Simo exhaled slowly, fogging the air in front of his face for just a moment before it dissipated. His finger curled around the trigger, familiar and patient. The Mosin Nagant was a rifle built for endurance, not elegance. It kicked like a mule, and the bolt was stiff in the cold, but it fired every time, and the 7.62 millimeter rounds punched through Soviet winter coats like they were paper. He centered the iron sight on the officer's chest. No fancy calculations, no breath-holding theatrics, just muscle memory, and a lifetime spent predicting where a moving target would be half a second from now. The shot cracked through the forest like lightning splitting a frozen lake. The officer crumpled backward into the snow, field glasses tumbling from his hands. For a moment, the entire Soviet line went silent, confused, scanning the white expanse for the source of the sound. But the sound traveled strangely in the cold. It bounced off snowbanks, echoed through trees, and came from everywhere and nowhere. Simo was already gone, from his position, crawling low through a pre-dug trench in the snow, dragging his rifle behind him. Martti was moving too, slipping between the birches like a shadow that had no business existing in daylight. They'd learned this in the first week. Shoot and move, always move, because the Soviets had mortars and they weren't shy about using them. 30 seconds later, the first shell screamed overhead and detonated in the spot where Simo had been lying. Snow and shattered wood erupted into the air. The concussion rattled his teeth, but he was already 200 meters away, settling into a new position behind a fallen pine. He reloaded. 5 rounds, brass casings, cold as death. Slide the bolt forward. Waited. The Soviets were shouting now, officers screaming at their men to advance, to find the sniper, to do something. But they were city boys, most of them. Factory workers from Leningrad, conscripts from Ukraine who'd never seen snow like this, never felt cold that turned to ice before it hit the ground. They moved in clumps, huddled together for warmth, and that made them easy. Simo picked his targets carefully, not the soldiers who looked terrified they'd freeze or retreat on their own, but the ones who looked competent, the ones organizing the others, the ones who posed a threat, a sergeant rallying a squad, a machine gunner setting up a Maxim on a tripod, a radio man trying to call in coordinates. One shot, one body, one less problem. By the time the sun, what little of it managed to claw through the overcast sky, reached its zenith, Simo had fired 11 rounds. Marty had taken 6 more targets from his position. 17 Soviet soldiers were dead or dying in the snow, and the advance had stalled. The forest swallowed the Finns whole, leaving no trace. No footprints in the deep snow where they'd packed it tight beneath them. No shell casings, which they collected religiously. No blood, because they never got close enough to bleed. Just silence. And the cold. December 15th, the 3rd day of holding the line at Kola. Simo crouched in a dugout shelter carved beneath the roots of a massive pine, gnawing on a frozen strip of dried elk meat. It tasted like leather and salt, but it was protein, and protein kept you alive when the temperature wanted you dead. Marty sat across from him, using a knife to pry ice out of the action of his rifle. Above them, the war continued. Soviet artillery hammered the Finnish positions every 2 hours like clockwork, but they were firing blind, shelling empty woods and snowbanks, while the real defenders hid in spider holes and root cellars, waiting for the noise to stop. "They've got to be running low on shells," Marty said, though his voice lacked conviction. Simo didn't answer. He'd seen the supply columns through his rifle sight yesterday, trucks and sleds stretching back for kilometers, loaded with ammunition, food, fuel. The Soviets had numbers, they had resources. They had Joseph Stalin screaming at them from Moscow to crush this insignificant little country before the world noticed how badly the invasion was going. Finland had snow, and men who knew how to use it. A young lieutenant named Lauri Turney ducked into the shelter, snow cascading off his white anorak. He was barely 19, but his eyes carried the weight of someone much older. "Colonel wants snipers forward. They're massing again near the river bend." Simo nodded, rising to his feet. His knees popped, the cold did that, made everything stiff and slow. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and followed Turney out into the gray light. The Finnish defensive line, if you could call it that, was a series of improvised positions scattered across 12 kilometers of forest. No trenches in the traditional sense, the ground was too frozen to dig, and besides, trenches were easy to spot from the air. Instead, the Finns used natural cover, fallen trees, rocky outcrops, the deep snowdrifts that collected in ravines. They moved constantly, never sleeping in the same position twice, always one step ahead of the Soviet artillery spotters. Simo and Marty skied forward, their long wooden skis hissing across the powder. The Soviets didn't have skis. They had boots and snowshoes, and both were useless in snow this deep. They floundered, they sank, they died. At the river bend, Simo could see the Soviet preparations. They'd brought up reinforcements overnight, fresh troops, who hadn't yet learned to fear the White Forest. Officers were barking orders, trying to organize an assault across the frozen river. They had maybe 200 men visible, with more waiting in the trees behind them. Simo settled into a firing position atop a small rise, packing snow around himself to break up his silhouette. Marty took a spot 30 meters to his right, doing the same. They worked in silence, efficient and practiced. The Soviets began their advance at noon. They came in waves, trying. to overwhelm the Finnish positions with sheer numbers. It was doctrine the Soviet military loved mass assaults, loved throwing bodies at problems until the problems stopped existing. Simo started with the officers. Always the officers. A captain at 280 meters, rallying his men with a raised pistol. One shot. The captain folded like a puppet with cut strings. A lieutenant trying to organize covering fire at 310 meters. Another shot. The lieutenant's helmet spun through the air, trailing red mist that froze before it hit the ground. The assault faltered. Men dove for cover, pressing themselves into the snow, returning fire blindly at an enemy they couldn't see. Soviet machine guns opened up, raking the Finnish tree line with suppressing fire, but they were shooting at nothing. Simo was 200 meters north of where they thought he was, and Marty was even farther. For 20 minutes, the battle raged. Soviet soldiers screamed for medics, for ammunition, for someone to tell them where the shots were coming from. Finnish ski troops materialized out of the forest, fired bursts from their Suomi submachine guns, then vanished before the Soviets could react. It was guerrilla warfare, but conducted in a landscape so hostile that the environment itself became a weapon. By the time the Soviets retreated, they'd left 43 bodies on the ice. The Finns had lost 2 men, both caught by lucky mortar rounds. Simo packed up his position, moving before the counter-battery fire could find him. His kill count for the day was 9 confirmed. Marty had 6. The numbers were starting to add up, though Simo tried not to think about it that way. They weren't numbers. They were men. Somebody's son. Somebody's brother. But they were also invaders, and this was his land. And he'd kill every last one of them, if that's what it took to keep them from his farm, from his family, from the country that had raised him to be quiet, stubborn, and impossibly hard to kill. December 23rd. 11 days into the defense. The Soviets had a name for him now. Belaya Smirt. White Death. Simo heard it from a prisoner they'd captured during a nighttime raid, a 17-year-old conscript from Minsk who'd been crying in the snow, half frozen, begging not to be shot. The Finnish troops gave him hot soup and a blanket, then sent him to a POW camp in the rear. They weren't monsters, but they needed him broken enough to talk first. "They say you're a ghost," the prisoner had whispered through chattering teeth. "That you can't be killed. That you've murdered hundreds of our men." Hundreds. Simo didn't know if that was true. He'd stopped counting after 60. The numbers blurred together after a while, became abstract. What mattered was that the line held, that his friends survived another day, that Finland remained Finland. But the Soviets were adapting. They'd started sending counter-sniper teams, men with scoped rifles and better training, tasked specifically with hunting the Finnish snipers. They worked in pairs, used decoys, and tried to draw fire. Simo had seen 3 such teams in the past week. 2 had withdrawn after losing men. The third was still out there, somewhere in the trees, patient and waiting. Christmas Eve approached with the quiet inevitability of a knife sliding between ribs. The forest was darker now, the sun barely climbing above the horizon before sinking again. Twilight lasted all day, a gray liminal space where shadows had no edges and everything looked like a threat. Simo was alone this time. Marty had been pulled back to defend another section of the line, and the other snipers were scattered across kilometers of front. That was fine. Simo preferred working alone. Less chance of someone else making noise, giving away the position. He'd chosen a spot overlooking a Soviet supply route, a narrow forest trail where trucks occasionally rumbled through, bringing ammunition and food to the forward positions. If he could disrupt that supply chain, even for a few hours, it would buy the Finnish defenders time to rest, rearm, reorganize. The first truck appeared at 1400 hours. Simo let it pass. Too risky. If he fired and missed, or if the truck got away, they'd know someone was watching. The second truck came 20 minutes later, moving slower, its engine grinding against the cold. Simo aimed not at the driver, but at the radiator. The Mosin Nagant cracked, and steam erupted from the front of the truck. The vehicle lurched to a stop, and the driver jumped out, cursing in Russian, examining the damage. Simo waited. Patience was its own form of ammunition. A third truck arrived, then a fourth. Soon there was a small convoy stalled on the road, soldiers milling around, officers shouting, everyone frustrated and exposed. They didn't know where the shot had come from. They didn't even know it was a shot, could have been mechanical failure, could have been anything. That's when Simo started killing them. The officer first, 340 meters, center mass. He dropped without a sound. Then the soldier tried to organize a search party, 290 meters. Headshot. His body sprawled across the snow, and the others finally understood they were under attack. Chaos. Beautiful, disorienting chaos. Soldiers dove for cover, fired wildly into the trees, called for backup on radios that crackled with static. But Simo was already moving, crawling through his tunnel system in the snow, emerging 100 meters west with a new angle, a new target. He fired 4 more rounds before withdrawing completely. By the time Soviet reinforcements arrived, he was 2 kilometers away, melting into the forest like he'd never existed. That night, back in the company shelter, he ate a Christmas dinner of canned meat, black bread, and weak coffee. Someone had found a bottle of vodka and passed it around. Simo took a small sip, felt the burn, and passed it on. He didn't drink much. Alcohol slowed reflexes, dulled instincts. In this war, being dull meant being dead. "How many today?" someone asked him. Simo shrugged. "Enough." They didn't press. Everyone in the room had their own count, their own weight. Some wore it openly, talked about their kills like fishermen comparing catches. Others, like Simo, kept it locked inside, where it couldn't poison anyone else. Outside, the temperature dropped to -43. The Soviet offensive had stalled. The line at Kala held. And in the darkness between the trees, the White Death waited for morning. January 7th, 1940. 27 days since the invasion began. The Soviets were getting desperate. Simo could see it in the way they moved now, less cautious, more aggressive, throwing men at the Finnish positions in waves that bordered on suicidal. The high command in Moscow was furious. How could a nation of 3 million people hold off an army of hundreds of thousands? The answer was simple. Because every meter of ground cost blood, and the Finns were willing to spend theirs more carefully. But desperation made the Soviets dangerous. They'd brought in their best units, the crack divisions, the ones with actual winter training, men who knew how to fight in snow. And they'd brought in artillery, lots of it. The forest was being systematically shelled, acres at a time, trying to flush out the Finnish defenders through sheer destructive force. Simo's position that morning was less than ideal. He was pinned in a rocky outcrop with limited escape routes, and the Soviets had spotted something, maybe tracks, maybe smoke from a distant campfire. He didn't know. But they were closing in, moving through the trees in coordinated groups, setting up interlocking fields of fire. Marty was with him again, and they both knew they were in trouble. "We need to move," Marty whispered, his breath clouding the air. "They've got us triangulated." Simo nodded. But moving meant exposing themselves, and that was a death sentence with this many enemies nearby. Then the mortars started. The first round landed 50 meters short, throwing up a geyser of snow and frozen earth. The second hit closer. The third closer still. "Now," Simo hissed. They broke from cover simultaneously, skiing hard toward the west, toward friendly lines that were supposedly 3 kilometers away. Behind them, the mortars found their position, obliterating the rocks they'd been hiding behind. Shrapnel whined through the air, and Simo felt something tug at his sleeve, a near miss, close enough to smell the metal. Soviet troops opened fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the tree line. Bullets zipped past, smacking into tree trunks, kicking up snow. Simo didn't return fire. No point. He needed distance, needed to break contact before they could organize a pursuit. They skied for 10 minutes straight, hearts hammering, lungs burning from the cold air. The forest blurred around them, white and gray and endless. Then, finally, the sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the eerie quiet of deep snow and wind through branches. They stopped in a ravine, gasping, checking for wounds. Simo's sleeve was torn, but the skin beneath was intact. Marty had taken a graze across his shoulder, nothing serious, but it would need cleaning. That was too close, Marty muttered. Simo nodded, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. The cold was getting to him. Or maybe it was fear. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. But they were alive. That's what mattered. They rejoined their unit that evening, and the lieutenant briefed them on the situation. The Soviets were preparing a major offensive, possibly their largest yet. Intelligence suggested they were massing tanks and infantry for a breakthrough attempt near the Kola River. If they succeeded, the entire Finnish defensive line would collapse. "We need every rifle," the lieutenant said, his eyes moving, across the assembled soldiers. "Every shot has to count." Simo checked his ammunition. 40 rounds left. 40 chances to make a difference. The offensive came at dawn, a creeping barrage of artillery that walked across the Finnish positions, followed by waves of Soviet infantry and T-26 light tanks. The Finns responded with everything they had: anti-tank rifles, satchel charges, Molotov cocktails made from gasoline and tar. Simo found a position on a hillside overlooking the main attack route. From here, he could see the entire battlefield, the Soviet tanks churning through the snow, the infantry huddled behind them for cover, the officers in the rear directing the assault. He started with the tank commanders. They stood in their open cupolas, trying to navigate and communicate. 1 shot per tank. The commanders fell, and the tanks became confused, stopped coordinating, became isolated targets for the Finnish anti-tank teams. Then he shifted to the infantry officers. A major directing artillery fire, a captain organizing a flanking maneuver, a lieutenant trying to rally broken troops. One by one, they fell. The Soviet offensive lasted 6 hours. By the end, they'd advanced less than 200 meters, and the cost was staggering. Burned-out tanks littered the snow. Bodies lay in heaps where machine gun fire had caught them in the open. The wounded screamed for help that wouldn't come, because the stretcher-bearers were dead too. And through it all, the White Death worked. Silent, methodical, unforgiving. When the Soviets finally withdrew, Simo had fired 37 rounds. He didn't know how many hits. He didn't want to know. He just packed up his rifle, skied back to the command post, and reported that the line had held again. February 11th, 1940. 62 days into the war. Simo Hi-Hat took a bullet to the face. It happened at dawn. He was in a forward position, engaging a Soviet patrol that had strayed too close to the Finnish lines. He'd fired 3 shots, dropped 3 men. Then an enemy sniper, one of the good ones, the ones who'd been hunting him for weeks, spotted his muzzle flash. The bullet hit him in the left cheek, traveling upward, shattering his jaw, exiting below his eye. The impact knocked him backward into the snow, and for a moment, the world went white and silent. Marty found him 30 seconds later, dragged him out of the position while Soviet fire raked overhead. Blood poured from Simo's face, steaming in the frozen air, soaking through his white camouflage until it looked like a butcher's apron. "Stay with me," Marty kept saying, though Simo couldn't respond. His jaw was gone. His face was a ruin. He was drowning in his own blood. They got him to a field hospital, a farmhouse converted into a surgical ward, where overworked doctors dealt with frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A surgeon looked at Simo's face, at the shattered bone and torn flesh, and shook his head. He won't survive the night. But Simo didn't get the message. He survived the night, and the next, and the one after that. He drifted in and out of consciousness for a week, fever dreams filled with snow and gunfire and the faces of men he'd killed. Sometimes he was back in the forest, finger on the trigger. Sometimes he was home on his farm, before the war, when the world made sense. When he finally woke fully, the war was over. The Treaty of Moscow had been signed on the 13th of March. Finland had lost territory 10% of its land, including the Karelian Isthmus, but it had survived. The Soviets had wanted to annex the entire country. They'd failed. The cost was staggering. 26,000 Finnish soldiers died, 70,000 wounded. The Soviets had lost somewhere between 126,000 and 167,000 men, depending on which sources you believed. The Winter War, they'd started calling it. 105 days of fighting in the coldest, cruelest conditions imaginable. Simo spent months recovering. Surgeons reconstructed his jaw using bone grafts and wire. He'd never looked the same. His face was scarred, asymmetrical, a permanent reminder of what the war had taken. But he was alive. When he was finally able to speak again, reporters wanted interviews. They wanted to know his kill count and wanted to turn him into a legend. The official records credited him with 505 confirmed kills, 219 with his rifle, the rest with a submachine gun during close engagements. Other estimates put the number higher. Simo refused to discuss it. "I did what was asked of me," he said through his reconstructed jaw, the words careful and slow, nothing more. He returned to his farm in Rautjärvi after the war. Though it was no longer Finnish soil, the Soviets had taken it in the peace treaty. So he moved to a new farm in a new region and spent the rest of his life hunting elk and avoiding attention. People called him a hero. They wrote books about him, made documentaries, and built monuments. But Simo never saw himself that way. He'd been a farmer who knew how to shoot, who'd defended his country when it needed defending, and who'd paid a price that couldn't be measured in scars alone. On cold winter nights, when the snow lay thick on the ground and the forest went silent, he'd sometimes stand at his window and stare out at the trees. And he'd remember the weight of the rifle in his hands, the sound of snow crunching under skis, the faces of young men who died far from home, in a war they probably didn't understand. He died in 2002, at the age of 96, in a nursing home in Hamina. The last interviews he gave were brief, uncomfortable. "War is never glorious," he said. "It's necessary sometimes, but never glorious." His funeral was attended by hundreds, veterans who'd served with him, historians who'd studied him, civilians who just wanted to pay respects to a man who'd become a symbol of Finnish resilience. They called him the greatest sniper in history, a ghost in the White Forest, the White Death. But in the end, he was just Simo Häyhä, a farmer, a soldier, a man who'd done his duty when his country called and who'd carried that weight for the rest of his life. The snow fell on his grave in Ruokoloti, soft and silent the way it always did in winter. And somewhere in those woods, along the old Russian border, where the birch trees stand white against the endless cold, you can still feel his presence, watching, waiting, invisible.